Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The salt-stained tavern reeked of rum and desperation, its wooden floors sticky with spilled drinks and broken dreams. Captain Elias Blackwater sat hunched over his pewter mug, dark eyes scanning the crowd of sailors, merchants, and cutthroats who frequented this god-forsaken establishment on the edge of Key West. The year was 1847, and the Caribbean had become a maze of secrets, where men like him thrived in the shadows between empires. Blackwater was not like other pirates. Where his peers boasted and brawled, he observed in silence. 3 jagged scars ran from his left temple to his jaw, souvenirs from a battle he never spoke of. His crew respected him not for his words, but for his uncanny ability to navigate treacherous waters and emerge victorious from impossible odds. They whispered that he could smell storms before clouds formed and find land when compasses spun wildly. Tonight, however, something else had drawn him to this particular tavern. A commotion near the back caught his attention. A weathered man with sun-damaged skin and bloodshot eyes was arguing loudly with a trader. "She's worth more than that," the drunk man slurred, gesturing wildly at a young woman sitting motionless beside him. "My daughter may not speak, but she's got other qualities." Blackwater's gaze shifted to the girl. She appeared to be no more than 18, with long dark hair that caught the candlelight like black silk. Her skin held the warm bronze of someone born to these islands, but her eyes, deep brown and impossibly sad, seemed to hold depths that didn't belong to someone so young. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, as if she'd learned long ago that movement only brought trouble. "The girl's mute, Rodriguez," the trader replied dismissively. "What use is a woman who can't even cry out? I'll give you 50 pieces of 8, and that's generous." Rodriguez's face flushed red with anger and alcohol. 50? She's my blood, she's a burden you can barely feed," the trader interrupted. "Take my offer, or find another fool willing to waste coin on damaged goods." Something twisted in Blackwater's chest, an emotion he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten its name. The girl hadn't looked up once during the entire exchange, as if she'd already accepted whatever fate awaited her. Her resignation reminded him of another time, another girl, whose scream still echoed in his nightmares. Without fully understanding why, Blackwater stood and approached their table. The trader looked up nervously. Everyone in these waters knew the reputation of the man with the scarred face. 100 pieces of 8, Blackwater said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Rodriguez's eyes widened greedily. "Captain Blackwater, I didn't see you there. 100, you say?" The trader started to protest, but one look from Blackwater silenced him. The pirate captain reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch, counting out the gold coins with deliberate precision. Each piece gleamed in the lamplight as it hit the wooden table. "She comes with me tonight," Blackwater stated. "No conditions, no returns." For the first time since he'd been watching, the girl looked up. Her eyes met his across the table, and Blackwater felt something shift in the air around them. A subtle change, like the moment before lightning strikes. Her gaze held no gratitude, no fear, just a strange recognition that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Rodriguez snatched up the coins with shaking hands. "Sold. Maria, you belong to the captain now. You'll do whatever he says, you understand?" The girl, Maria, nodded once, but her eyes never left Blackwater's face. There was something unsettling about her stare, as if she could see past his scars, past his reputation, into the parts of himself he kept locked away. "Come," Blackwater said simply, extending his hand. Maria rose gracefully, ignoring her father's drunken farewell. She was smaller than he'd expected, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder, but she moved with a fluid confidence that suggested strength beneath her delicate appearance. She placed her hand in his without hesitation, and Blackwater felt a jolt of electricity run up his arm. The walk to the harbor was conducted in silence. Blackwater's ship, the Serpent's Wake, loomed before them like a dark leviathan against the star-filled sky. His crew members on watch duty straightened as they approached, their curious eyes taking in their captain's unexpected companion. "Prepare the small cabin aft," Blackwater instructed his first mate, Davies. The lady will be staying with us. Davies, a grizzled veteran with arms covered in tattoos, nodded but couldn't hide his surprise. In all his years serving under Blackwater, the captain had never brought a woman aboard. Not for pleasure, not for ransom, not for any reason. As they boarded the ship, Maria paused at the gangplank. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. The wind had died completely, leaving the harbor eerily quiet, but her expression suggested she was hearing voices in the silence. Blackwater watched her carefully. "What is it?" Maria turned to look at him, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak. Instead, she simply shook her head and continued aboard. The crew had gathered on deck now, drawn by curiosity and the novelty of their situation. Blackwater could see the questions in their eyes, but he offered no explanations. He led Maria to her cabin, a small but clean space that had once served as storage. "You'll be safe here," he said, lighting a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. "No one will disturb you without my permission." Maria nodded and sat on the narrow bed. She looked around the cabin with those unsettling eyes, and Blackwater got the distinct impression she was cataloging more than just the physical space. It was as if she was sensing things that weren't visible to normal sight. "Can you understand me?" he asked gently. Another nod. "But you cannot speak?" This time she hesitated before nodding, and Blackwater caught something in her expression. Not quite deception, but something close to it. Before he could analyze it further, she pointed toward the small porthole. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, though the evening had been clear when they'd left the tavern. "A storm's coming," Blackwater acknowledged. "We'll ride it out here in the harbor." But Maria shook her head emphatically and pointed again, this time more urgently. She stood and moved to the porthole, pressing her palm against the glass. Her breathing quickened, and she turned back to him with wide, frightened eyes. For the first time in years, Blackwater felt uncertainty creep into his bones. The girl was reacting to something he couldn't see or hear, something that terrified her. Outside, the first drops of rain began to patter against the ship's deck, and in the distance, thunder rolled across the water like the voice of an angry god. As if summoned by the sound, Maria suddenly pressed her hands to her ears and closed her eyes tightly. Her mouth opened in what should have been a scream, but no sound emerged. She remained frozen in that position for several heartbeats before slowly lowering her hands. When she looked at him again, there was something different in her eyes, an ancient knowledge that had no business residing in someone so young. The storm was coming, but Blackwater was beginning to suspect it was the least of their worries. The storm struck with supernatural fury, turning the harbor into a cauldron of churning black water and howling winds. But what unsettled Captain Blackwater's crew wasn't the tempest itself. It was how the mute girl had known it was coming hours before the first cloud appeared. Maria sat in her cabin throughout the night, unnaturally calm while the Serpent's Wake groaned and pitched against her anchor chains. Blackwater found himself checking on her repeatedly, drawn by an inexplicable need to ensure her safety. Each time he peered through her door, she was in the same position, sitting cross-legged on her bed, eyes closed, lips moving silently as if engaged in conversation with invisible companions. By dawn, the storm had passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind crystalline skies and an ocean so still it resembled polished glass. The crew emerged from below deck, shaking their heads in amazement at the night's strange weather patterns. "Never seen anything like it, Captain," Davies muttered, coiling rope with hands that still trembled slightly. Storm came from nowhere and vanished just as quick, almost like something was controlling it. Blackwater said nothing, but his scarred face bore a troubled expression. He'd survived countless tempests in these waters, but last night had felt different, charged with an energy that made his old wounds ache and filled his dreams with half-remembered nightmares. "Prepare to sail," he ordered. "We head for the deeper waters." "Where to, Captain?" Davies asked. "South, into the Devil's Triangle." The crew exchanged nervous glances. The waters between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico were notorious among sailors. Ships disappeared there without explanation. Compasses spun wildly, and even the most experienced navigators lost their way. Most pirates avoided the area entirely, preferring the predictable dangers of naval patrols to the unknown terrors that lurked in those cursed seas. As the crew prepared to weigh anchor, Maria emerged from her cabin for the first time since the previous evening. She wore the same simple dress, but something about her presence had changed. She moved across the deck with purpose, pausing at the ship's rail to stare out at the horizon. Girl's got her sea legs, observed Tobias, the ship's cook, a one-eyed man with arms thick as tree trunks. Most landlubbers would be green around the gills after a night like that, but Maria wasn't looking at the water. She was listening, her head tilted at an angle that suggested intense concentration, and her fingers gripped the rail so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Suddenly she spun around and pointed northeast, toward a cluster of small islands barely visible in the distance. Blackwater followed her gaze and felt his blood turn cold. Those islands weren't supposed to be there. He'd sailed these waters for 15 years and knew every reef, every outcropping, every navigational hazard. The charts in his cabin showed nothing but open ocean in that direction. "Davies," he called, never taking his eyes off the mysterious islands. "Bring me the charts." His first mate hurried below and returned with a leather portfolio containing detailed maps of the Caribbean. Blackwater spread the largest chart across a wooden crate, using his compass to determine their exact position. According to every piece of navigational information at his disposal, they were staring at empty sea. Maria approached the chart table, moving with that same unsettling grace. She looked down at the map for a long moment, then placed her finger on a spot roughly 20 miles southeast of their current position. The location she indicated was marked as deep ocean, but when Blackwater looked up from the chart, he could see land exactly where she was pointing. "Impossible," Davies whispered. "Those islands, they weren't there yesterday." The crew had gathered around now, their usual swagger replaced by nervous uncertainty. These were men who'd faced down naval ships and survived battles that would break lesser souls, but they were also superstitious creatures who understood that the sea held mysteries beyond human comprehension. Maria tugged at Blackwater's sleeve, drawing his attention back to her. She pointed again at the Phantom Islands, then pressed both hands to her chest as if trying to contain something that wanted to escape. Her eyes held a desperate urgency that needed no words to communicate its meaning. "She wants us to go there," Blackwater said quietly. "Captain," Davies ventured carefully, "maybe we should consider set course for those islands." Blackwater interrupted. "Full sail." His crew hesitated for a moment before jumping into action. They'd followed their captain into impossible situations before, and his instincts had never failed them. But as the Serpent's Wake changed course and began cutting through the unnaturally calm waters toward the mysterious landmasses, more than one sailor touched the charms and talismans they wore for protection. As they drew closer, details of the islands became visible. 3 separate landmasses rose from the azure depths like the peaks of some drowned mountain range. The largest was covered in dense jungle, its canopy so thick that no details of the interior were visible. The smallest appeared to be little more than a rocky outcropping crowned with twisted trees that looked dead, despite the tropical climate. But it was the middle island that captured everyone's attention. Ancient stone structures jutted from its center, not the crude huts one might expect from a remote Caribbean island, but sophisticated architecture that seemed to predate any known civilization in the region. Massive stone blocks fitted together with mathematical precision formed what appeared to be a temple or ceremonial complex. Maria gripped the rail so tightly now that Blackwater worried she might hurt herself. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, and when she turned to look at him, tears were streaming down her face. For the first time since he'd met her, genuine terror dominated her features. "We can turn back," Blackwater offered gently, but Maria shook her head emphatically. She pointed toward the Temple Island again, then placed her hand over her heart. Whatever was calling to her from that place, she had no choice but to answer. As they approached the natural harbor between the islands, the wind died completely. The sudden stillness was so profound that the crew's voices seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Even the eternal sound of waves against the hull faded to nothing, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. "Drop anchor," Blackwater commanded. "Prepare the longboat." "Captain," Davies said quietly, stepping close enough that only Blackwater could hear him. "I've got a bad feeling about this place. The water here, it's too clear. Look down." Blackwater peered over the side and felt his stomach lurch. The water was indeed impossibly transparent, revealing details of the ocean floor that should have been hidden by depth and distance. Massive stone pillars rose from the depths like the ribs of some colossal skeleton, and carved symbols covered their surfaces, symbols that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly. More disturbing still were the shapes moving between the pillars. At first glance they looked like schools of fish, but their movements were too coordinated, too purposeful. They circled the stone columns in patterns that suggested intelligence, and occasionally one would break away from the group to rise toward the surface before diving back into the depths. Maria had noticed them too. She leaned far over the rail, watching the underwater dance with an expression of recognition that chilled Blackwater's soul. When one of the creatures rose close enough to the surface for its true nature to become apparent, several crew members gasped in shock. It wasn't a fish at all, but something that might once have been human. Its elongated limbs moved with fluid grace through the water, and gill slits along its neck opened and closed rhythmically. But it was the creature's eyes that froze the blood in every man's veins. Ancient, intelligent, and filled with a sadness that spoke of eons spent in watery exile. The thing regarded them for a long moment before diving back into the depths, but its brief appearance had left the crew shaken. These weren't waters meant for the living, and everyone aboard the Serpent's Wake understood that they'd sailed beyond the boundaries of the natural world. Maria turned away from the rail and walked toward the longboat with determined steps. She climbed in without assistance and sat facing the Temple Island, waiting for others to join her. Her message was clear. Whatever lay ahead, she intended to face it. Blackwater looked at his crew's frightened faces and made his decision. Some journeys had to be taken alone. The Temple Island's black sand beach crunched beneath their boots as Blackwater, Maria, and 3 volunteer crew members dragged the longboat above the tide line. The silence here was absolute. No birds called from the jungle canopy. No insects buzzed in the humid air. Even their own breathing seemed muffled by an invisible presence. Maria stepped onto the sand and immediately fell to her knees, pressing her palms against the dark granules. Her body trembled as if electric current was flowing through the ground into her flesh. When she looked up at Blackwater, her eyes had changed. The brown irises now held flecks of silver that caught the sunlight like fragments of broken mirrors. "Captain," whispered Jenkins, the youngest crew member, "maybe we should go back to the ship." But Maria was already moving toward the stone steps that led up from the beach, carved from the same black rock as the sand. They spiraled upward through dense vegetation toward the temple complex visible above the tree line. Ancient symbols covered every surface, their meaning lost to time but somehow familiar to anyone who looked upon them. As they climbed, the air grew thicker and charged with energy that made their skin crawl. Halfway up the steps, Maria stopped and turned toward a section of jungle that looked identical to every other part. She pointed into the green darkness and made urgent gestures for them to follow. "There's nothing there," Davies protested, but Maria was already pushing through the undergrowth. The hidden path revealed itself as they walked, as if the jungle was reshaping itself around their passage. Vines pulled back, branches lifted out of their way, and the ground beneath their feet became smooth stone. They emerged into a circular clearing dominated by a black pool that reflected no light despite the sun blazing overhead. Maria approached the water's edge and knelt, staring into depths that seemed to extend far beyond what should have been possible on such a small island. The pool's surface was perfectly still, creating a mirror so dark it looked like a window into the void between stars. Without warning, images began to form in the water. Not reflections, but visions of the past playing out in the obsidian depths. Blackwater saw ships he didn't recognize sailing under flags that belonged to no known nation. He watched sailors with the same silver-flecked eyes as Maria walking on decks that defied the laws of physics. And then he saw himself, but not as he was now. The vision showed a younger Elias Blackwater standing on a burning ship, holding a woman with long dark hair. She was screaming, but not in pain, in rage. Power flowed from her outstretched hands, tearing apart the vessels that surrounded them. But there were too many enemies, and in the end they overwhelmed her. As she fell, her final words echoed across the water. "Find me, Elias. Find me when the sea calls you home." The woman in his arms had Maria's face. Blackwater staggered backward, his scarred features pale with shock. The pool's surface returned to its lifeless black, but the images were burned into his memory. 20 years ago, he'd lost everything in a battle he'd tried to forget. The woman he'd loved, the ship he'd called home, even his own identity, all consumed by forces he'd never understood. Maria stood and walked to him, placing her small hand against the scars on his face. When her fingers touched the old wounds, memories flooded back with painful clarity. The woman he'd loved hadn't been entirely human. She'd been something more, something connected to the ancient powers that slept beneath the Caribbean waves. And when she died, part of her had remained, waiting for the right vessel to return. "You're her," he whispered, though he knew Maria couldn't answer with words. But she didn't need to. The silver in her eyes grew brighter, and for a moment Blackwater could see through the young woman's features to the face of his lost love. The same intelligence, the same fierce spirit, the same power that had once moved storms and commanded the loyalty of creatures that dwelt in oceanic depths. A sound like whale song echoed from the pool, though no whale had ever made such haunting music. The water began to glow with phosphorescent light, and shapes moved in its depths. The same elongated figures they'd seen swimming beneath their ship. But now Blackwater understood what they were. They were the crew of his old ship, transformed by the same power that flowed through Maria. They'd been waiting in the depths for 20 years, holding vigil until their captain and their sorceress could be reunited. The sea had preserved them, changed them, but never let them truly die. Maria took his hand and led him back toward the temple steps. But they weren't retreating. They were ascending to face whatever waited in the stone chambers above. The air grew colder as they climbed, and Blackwater could feel ancient eyes watching their progress. At the temple's entrance, massive doors carved with maritime symbols stood partially open. Beyond the threshold lay darkness, so complete it seemed solid. But Maria walked forward without hesitation, and the silver light in her eyes grew bright enough to illuminate their path. Inside, the temple was larger than its external dimensions should have allowed. Corridors stretched away in directions that defied geometry, and the sound of distant waves echoed from chambers that couldn't possibly connect to the sea. At the center of the complex stood an altar carved from a single piece of coral, its surface stained with substances that might once have been blood. Maria approached the altar and placed both hands on its surface. The moment her skin made contact, the entire temple came alive. Symbols on the walls blazed with silver fire, the floor trembled with power, and the sound of voices, thousands of voices, whispered in languages that predated human speech. The ritual had begun, and there was no turning back. The altar erupted with blinding silver light as Maria's transformation reached its climax. Her body rose several inches above the coral surface, suspended by forces that made the temple walls vibrate like ship timbers in a hurricane. The whispers of ancient voices crescendoed into a roar that threatened to shatter Blackwater's sanity, but he couldn't look away from the woman floating before him. Maria's features were shifting, aging, and becoming more defined. The innocent island girl was dissolving like sea foam, revealing the powerful sorceress who had died in his arms 20 years ago. When her feet touched the altar again, she was no longer mute. Her first words in 2 decades emerged as a voice that commanded storms. "Hello, my beloved captain." Blackwater's legs nearly buckled. "Seraphina, I told you the sea would call you home," she said, stepping down from the altar with fluid grace. "Though I admit, I didn't expect to spend 20 years locked inside a child's mind, watching the world through borrowed eyes. How is this possible?" Seraphina gestured toward the temple walls, where the blazing symbols told the story of her resurrection. "When those Spanish ships destroyed our vessel, I poured my dying essence into the deepest currents. The sea carried my spirit to this place, where the old powers still run strong, but I needed an anchor in the living world, someone born with the right bloodline, the right sensitivity to otherworldly forces. Maria, a distant descendant of the first people who worshipped here, centuries before Columbus ever dreamed of crossing the Atlantic. Her father sold her to you because he feared what she was becoming, the dreams, the visions, the way she could hear voices from the deep. He thought drink would wash away his guilt, but fate had already chosen her path. Outside the temple, the sound of running feet echoed across stone steps. Davies and the others were approaching, likely drawn by the supernatural light that was now pouring from every window and doorway. But Seraphina raised her hand, and a barrier of shimmering air sealed the entrance. "Your crew cannot enter until our business is finished," she explained. "What I'm about to offer you requires a clear mind, free from the influence of frightened men." Blackwater circled the altar slowly, studying this woman who was both stranger and beloved. "You want me to resume our old life, to sail the cursed waters with a crew of transformed sailors and a sorceress who commands powers that defy natural law. I want you to reclaim what was stolen from us." Seraphina's eyes blazed with silver fire. "Those Spanish dogs didn't just sink our ship. They destroyed something sacred. We were protecting the old places, keeping the balance between the world of men and the realm beneath the waves. Without us, that balance has shifted." She gestured toward the temple's eastern wall, which had become transparent like glass. Through it, Blackwater could see across the Caribbean to distant shores where massive ships flew the flags of expanding empires. European powers were carving up the New World, bringing industrialization and exploitation to lands that had remained largely unchanged for millennia. The old gods are dying, Serafina continued. The sacred places are being desecrated, turned into sugar plantations and military bases. The creatures of the deep are retreating to the abyssal depths because there's no longer room for them in waters polluted by human ambition. And you think we can stop an empire? I think we can remind them that some boundaries should never be crossed. Serafina approached him, her hand trailing along his scarred face. Your crew below. They're not just transformed sailors, Elias. They're guardians, waiting to resume their eternal patrol of waters that lesser men fear to sail. Through the transparent wall, Blackwater watched his old crew rising from the depths. They moved through the crystal-clear water with inhuman grace, their bodies adapted to life beneath the waves but their loyalty unchanged. These men had followed him into death itself and beyond, holding vigil in watery tombs until their captain could join them again. What of Maria? He asked. The girl whose body you've claimed? Serafina's expression softened with genuine remorse. She volunteered, though she didn't understand what that meant at first. When my essence touched hers, she saw everything, our love, our mission, the price of bringing me back. She chose to step aside so I could return, but she's not gone. Her spirit rests in the same realm where I waited for 20 years. Peaceful, dreaming, but safe. And if I refuse, then you remain mortal, and I return to the depths to wait for another opportunity that may never come. Your transformed crew will eventually forget their human lives entirely, becoming just another mystery of the deep. The balance will continue shifting until the old powers fade completely. Blackwater looked out at his supernatural crew, then back at the woman who had defined his life for decades, even in death. The choice before him was clear but impossible: mortality and the gradual decay of everything he'd once fought to protect, or transformation into something beyond human, but eternally bound to purposes larger than himself. The Spanish fleet that destroyed us, he said finally. Where are they now? Serafina smiled, and in that expression, Blackwater saw both love and terrible purpose. Admiral Cortez's great-grandson commands the Caribbean fleet from Port Royal. His ships patrol these waters with orders to eliminate any supernatural threats to Spanish colonial interests. He carries his ancestors' blessed sword, the same blade that dealt my killing blow. Then we have a debt to collect. Serafina nodded and walked to the altar where ancient implements lay waiting. A chalice carved from black coral held seawater that glowed with phosphorescent light, and beside it rested a dagger whose edge seemed to drink in the surrounding illumination. The transformation cannot be undone, she warned. You'll retain your human form and consciousness, but you'll be bound to the sea as surely as the tides are bound to the moon. Death will become meaningless, but so will the simple pleasures of mortal existence. Blackwater took the dagger without hesitation. The blade felt warm against his palm, as if it contained its own life force. I died 20 years ago with you. Everything since then has just been borrowed time. He drew the edge across his palm, letting blood drip into the glowing chalice. The seawater began to bubble and churn, releasing vapors that carried the scent of storms and the songs of deep-dwelling creatures. When Serafina added her own blood to the mixture, the liquid turned silver and began to sing with voices that spoke his name. Drink, she whispered, and let the sea reclaim its own. The potion burned like liquid fire down his throat, but the pain was followed by a rush of power that made his old scars tingle with electricity. He felt his consciousness expanding, connecting to currents and depths he'd never imagined. Every drop of water in the Caribbean became part of his awareness. Every creature that swam in those waters became an extension of his will. When the transformation was complete, Blackwater opened eyes that now held the same silver flecks as Serafina's. Through the temple walls, he could see his ship being surrounded by crew members who no longer needed to breathe air or fear the crushing depths. They were ready to sail waters that existed between the mortal world and realms where ancient powers still held dominion. Welcome home, Captain, Serafina said, taking his transformed hand in hers. Now let's remind the world why some legends refuse to die. The temple barriers dissolved, and they walked out together to face whatever storms awaited them in the cursed waters of the Caribbean. Behind them, the altar continued to glow with silver fire, a beacon that would call to others like Maria. those born with the gift to hear the sea's deepest secrets and the courage to answer its call. The lonely pirate's journey was complete, but Captain Blackwater's legend was just beginning.